Hello and welcome. In the past year, I've gotten a little bit more advanced with the art of YouTubing, so I'm going to encourage you now for the first time to hit like, which I believe is over there, and subscribe, which is probably just below here, which will allow you to be reminded of future videos which come out here, which is not too often. And I'd also like to encourage you to comment below and share with us examples that you like and can think of music that depicts love. I know love is this elusive thing that's difficult to contain or define, but it's quite special when composers and other musicians try to depict love in their music. And it can be quite powerful too. You know, for example, just to start off, there are examples when in consumerism, like people identify ways in which love in music can perhaps affect people's consumer behaviors, the way they spend money. So we can see romantic orchestral music in plenty of ads. And since one of the most famous examples of love in music is Peter Tchaikovsky's music narrating the Romeo and Juliet story, there's plenty of examples of this being used in film. For example, the very first film that had a movie score, so a musical score, and recorded dialogue in it, The Jazz Singer from way back in 1927, all kinds of recent TV shows such as The Simpsons, and here's a couple of examples of it in film.
Hey, there she is.
I've been waiting for all my life.
Before we talk about what Tchaikovsky's doing musically in Romeo and Juliet, I do want to first talk about what's going on in his personal life a little bit, because for Tchaikovsky, who he is and what's going on for him personally is always influencing his musical decision making, and it's often very interesting, unfortunately for him, often in ways that are quite tragic, because Tchaikovsky was a gay man, but not being able to be comfortable with himself or out of the closet during his lifetime. He did marry, he never had children, and he kept his marriage together even though he didn't live with his wife, just to be able to give the impression that he was married, and in doing so he had to pay her an allowance, and all sorts of negotiations and drama resulted, and there's many different theories of how he died or why he died or whether it was a suicide. I'm not going to give you my hypothesis, which comes from one of the accounts of his life that I've read, but feel free to look further on your own time. But the reason I think of this is because basically Tchaikovsky seemed to think of himself as a tragic lover, and being a gay man, he almost seemed to identify as a woman who was always being spurned and loved. So this led to him being interested in composing music related to some famous stories that captured that. So we can look at his opera, The Queen of Spades, the orchestral piece Francesca da Rimini. So like Romeo and Juliet, these are stories of people that have been denied their ability to love, that are really struggling personally, and that's why there's so much drama, romance, yearning, and at times tragedy in his music. So Tchaikovsky, this young composer, in that Romeo and Juliet was one of his first pieces that we know now and still play, but at that point in time there wasn't much precedence for what it meant to be a composer in Russia. Certainly previously there was the great operatic composer Glinka, but at this point in time, there wasn't really much of a tradition of studying music professionally, let alone having a career of writing it. Now, a little bit older than Tchaikovsky was the well-known group of, the Mighty Five. They're called the Mighty Five now, and these five gentlemen were certainly around, but they weren't all necessarily pursuing composition full-time. It was sort of like a club that met together and talked about music and occasionally, wrote music. But they're one of multiple different sort of perspectives from which Tchaikovsky emerges as his own unique individual, because those gentlemen, at least at that point in time, were more interested in Russian folk music and how they could include that in their more classical compositions and celebrate that as Russian culture. Tchaikovsky got to be among the very first class of students at the St. Petersburg Conservatory of Music. So unlike the gentleman in the Mighty Russian Five, he had a more formal training in music. But it wasn't necessarily more Russian, because his primary instructor was Anton Rubinstein, who had himself had a more German classical sort of training in music. So at this point in time, Tchaikovsky is he's inheriting things like sonata form and classical style, and he's certainly aware of what's going on with Russian folk influences. And how does it all come out in the wash? Well, with Romeo and Juliet, he had this correspondence with one of the group of five, Balakirev, who was both a composer but also a conductor. So he had opportunities to have music be performed that maybe interested Tchaikovsky. So over the period of 10 years, Tchaikovsky wrote multiple versions of Romeo and Juliet, and sort of through this piece developed his own style and his own priorities as a composer. And what's really cool about this piece is it's not just classical, it's not just romantic, but he takes classical form, he takes the most well-known blueprint or form of classical music, the sonata, and then he takes this story from the Renaissance era, Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, and he takes different components of the story and basically inserts them into all of the different ingredients of sonata form. So I'm creating these videos, and it seems like you're watching them from the perspective of being a conductor. And so then what does it mean for me to say that this is an interpretive video, or that I'm talking about my interpretation? Well, what this suggests is that these things that I'm considering and learning about the music is going to influence the way that I want the music to sound when I work with an orchestra. And that's certainly the case with Tchaikovsky, and I think it's important for us to have that story, Romeo and Juliet, in mind when we perform this piece, because really everything that happens in the music can be pointed to having a connection in terms of Shakespeare's story. So, for example, the very beginning of the piece, this is the theme of Friar Lawrence. Some people might choose to have this music sound more melancholy or somber, slow. Some people choose to have it be upbeat and a little quicker. So I think it's important to consider who Friar Lawrence is and his character and his role in the story, and that leads to me pursuing a little bit more of a dignified and sort of wise impression, and hopefully that comes across with what we did. So after the introduction depicting Friar Lawrence, it's still a long ways away that we finally hear the music, the love theme that you saw earlier in that excerpt from Wayne's World. So what comes after the sonata form's introduction is the first theme in the music, and it's quite a while until even that arrives. The first theme is the Strife Theme, right? Because we have this this conflict between the Montagues and the Capulets, these two families that oppose each other. And so the next music that arrives that fulfills the theme too within a sonata form and is now commonly known as the love theme is music that's not just a beautiful and loving phrase, but Tchaikovsky also gives us the sensation of the two lovers meeting and at later points in time in the story being reunited, when they've been separate. So the music crescendos up, it rises, and there's this feeling of arrival that happens as the two people So what a composer does next with sonata form is not so dissimilar from what a storyteller would do using your traditional story arc, in that once you have your characters introduced, and in Tchaikovsky's case, he's introduced his musical themes, it's next this question of how they interact, and in the case of a sonata form, the development section is a large part of that. So what happens in terms of the unfolding of the plot, how certain characters do or don't interact, and what those sorts of things will lead to as we get closer to our conclusion. So for Tchaikovsky's case, with Romeo and Juliet, you have in the story the consideration of whether Romeo and his family members are going to seek revenge, if they're going to exact revenge upon Tybalt for the death of Mercutio. You also have this consideration of how and whether Romeo and Juliet will be able to elope together. So the plot is sort of unfolding, and how they communicate with Friar Lawrence and try to secure their safe passage and communicate with each other, and unfortunately they're not able to, which leads to even more tragedy in the story. So for Tchaikovsky, he's following the story and he's following sonata form, but he goes beyond that, because basically he comes to this musical dead end where the most tragic sounds with the death of the lovers occur and the music stops. So what happens next? Well, one thing that's so amazing about this story and this piece of music is that for me, you have these dual poles of love and hate, and basically the story and the music are this warning about what hate leads to. But for Tchaikovsky, just like in the story, despite the lovers dying, we see this epilogue where there's hope, where there's great tragedy, but what can we learn from it? Well, first off, Tchaikovsky shows that the two souls of the lovers are reunited as they basically ascend. And what gives us hope from this story is what the families take from the death of the lovers, in that they say, okay, this is what our really meaningless hatred of each other can lead to. And that we're going to learn from this great tragedy, and they pledge to work together and to not hate one another in the future as we sort of look towards the horizon at the end of the story, what's to come, you know? It's really at this point in time, on the 1-year anniversary of the death of George Floyd in this country, it's the same kind of question. What are we going to learn from tragedy? Are we going to work towards creating a better society for ourselves and for the people that come after us? And I feel like the greatest music in history, not just Romeo and Juliet, but other pieces that I love and that we've looked at and I look forward to doing in the future, they can also show us that. What does it mean to be a human in the fullest of potential?